The fog lay over the straits like unspun wool the Friday we shoved off. Passengers who had abandoned their automobiles and cell phones at the dock were entering a curated dream. 3 nights aboard the coal-fired steamship Magnolia, every corridor dressed as if 1925 had never ended. Stewards wore crisp whites, gramophones crooned in the lounges, and flappers practiced the Charleston under strings of paper lanterns. I, Captain Elias Shaw, had been hired not only to keep Magnolia's smokestacks drawing, but to safeguard the illusion. The organisers called the weekend the Roaring Crossing. We would steam from Port Adams to Tulliver Island and back, pausing nowhere a modern ringtone could pierce the spell. Among the 112 guests was Vivian Durant, the celebrated concert violinist, meant to be our glittering centerpiece. Her Strad copy and her reputation were equally polished. Before Saturday's gala, she would perform Saint-Saëns on the afterdeck, while fireworks burst above the paddle wheels. It did not work out that way. Friday afternoon, Vivian rehearsed on the boat deck. Even over the engine's slow chuff, I could hear her tone, warm enough to melt brass handrails. I watched from the bridge wing a moment, then returned to my charts. The strait is narrow, the rocks patient, and Magnolia answers her rudder like a ballroom dancer in lead shoes. I had no time for music. At dinner, however, Vivian's table was near mine, and I observed the miniature society that travels wherever fame goes. She sat between Terence Lyle, a red-haired pianist hired to accompany her, and Opal Kendrick, the event director, whose flapper beads rattled whenever she blinked. Across the linen was Aubrey March, a rail-thin gentleman in a double-breasted suit, slightly too authentic, cigarette holder and all. An antique dealer named Caldwell Priest rounded out the party. He carried a walking stick tipped with silver and claimed his grandfather had smuggled whiskey across the same waters. To the casual eye, they were cordial. A seasoned ferry captain knows the difference between cordial and comfortable. The glances passing over the soup course suggested undercurrents sharper than any reef. At 23:37, Vivian finished a short, informal set in the first-class lounge. She took her bows beneath chandeliers, burning electric bulbs cunningly shaped like gas mantles. Several passengers lingered, asking for autographs on souvenir programs. At midnight, the steward's bell told me all guests were supposed to be in their cabins. At So 26, the illusion shattered. Man overboard port side. The cry came from my deck watch, Carla Jimenez. I was on the bridge, logging our position. We killed the engines, swung the searchlights, and mustered the crew. But the sea below was black glass, holding only our warped reflection in the fog. Then Carla's radio crackled again. "Correction, Captain. Passenger not in the water. She's on the promenade, aft stairwell. Injured, bad." I turned the bridge over to my first officer and sprinted aft. Vivian Durant lay at the foot of the grand staircase that spiraled from the boat deck to the promenade. One of our stewards, knuckles white against a mahogany newel post, said he'd found her after hearing a violin hit the deck with a sound like someone stepping on thin ice. Vivian's eyes were open but unfocused. Blood threaded through her hair. The violin, its neck snapped, lay 3 steps above her. The ship's nurse secured her neck and ordered a stretcher. We carried her to the infirmary, the passengers make-believe collapsing into frantic whispers behind us. By 01:50, we knew Vivian would live, but would not walk for some time. 3 vertebrae were cracked. The nearest landfall was still 4 hours away at Magnolia's best speed. I radioed the Coast Guard, arranged a rendezvous at dawn, and taped off the staircase like a crime scene, because that is what it had become in my mind. We had no police aboard, but the master of a vessel bears responsibility for everything from boiler pressure to murder. Until authorities came aboard, Magnolia was my floating courthouse. I pocketed a notebook and began to ask questions. The staircase itself was elaborate: mahogany treads, brass carpet rods, and a smooth banister polished by 1,000 excursions. I ran my gloved hand along that banister and felt something gritty. Under the beam of my flashlight, the varnished wood glittered with pale dust. I scraped up a fleck. Rosé. The stuff violinists rub on bow hair for grip. Slip on polished wood, hit your head, tumble, clear enough. Yet why was rosin on a banister 8 feet from where Vivian had been playing? More curious, patches of the rail were damp, as though someone had smeared it with grease, then dusted the rosin to hide the shine. My next stop was the ruined violin, resting on a felt cloth in the lounge. The quarter-cracked neck revealed fresh splinters, no prior damage. Crumbs of that same rosin-coloured grit peppered the fingerboard. A crime has a language. I was learning its alphabet. I started with Terence Lyle, the pianist. His cabin smelled of tobacco and cologne that tried too hard. He opened the door wearing pyjamas that wanted to be called loungewear. "Captain," he said, smoothing his hair, "how is Vivian? Dreadful business." "Alive. Mr. Lyle, may I see your hands?" He held them up, long, slender fingers trembling visibly. "I tried to steady her after the fall," he said. "Couldn't find a pulse at first." I checked his cuffs, clean. On his bureau lay an open tin of Hillman's band greasers, a brand favoured by horn players to keep slides smooth. "Do you use that?" I asked. He shrugged. "Piano keys dry out in salt air." I noted the lie. Ivory dislikes moisture more than dryness. And I noticed a residue of pale dust on the rim of the tin. Opal Kendrick, event director, met me in her parlour deck office. Her beads were off, her eyes were red. She had been trying to compose a statement for the press, she said, should word escape containment. When I asked about Vivian, she launched instead into the injury done to Magnolia's reputation. I redirected her. Did Ms. Durant have enemies aboard? "Musicians breed rivalries," she answered, "and admirers. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." I asked where she had been at midnight. "Checking the first-class corridors for guests breaking our no electronics rule. Someone played a tinny hip-hop song from a phone earlier, and it nearly ruined the Charleston contest. Her alibi could be tested. 4 stewards were posted on those corridors." Aubrey March answered his door as though expecting applause, cigarette holder between his teeth, though Magnolia is strictly non-smoking inside. He claimed to have been asleep since 11, alone. When I inquired about his relationship to Vivian Durant, he smirked. "A patron must be allowed a certain proximity to his artist," he said. "I financed her touring quartet. Vivian appreciated me. The others resented my influence." On his dresser, I saw a corked vial holding scented castor oil, used in the 1920s to polish patent leather shoes. I asked whether he had loaned that vial to anyone. "To people who know how to dress, maybe." "Captain, are we finished? This cruise has already turned into something more Agatha Christie than Cole Porter." We were not finished, but I moved on. Caldwell Priest sat in the ship's library, cane across his knees. He was reading a bound 1923 edition of the Nautical Almanac, as though facts taste better if they've aged. I asked whether he had witnessed the fall. "No, sir. I was aft, on the boat deck, photographing the funnel sparks. You may inspect my camera if you wish, though it's digital. Don't tell Ms. Kendrick." He offered a rueful grin. No rosin on the cane, no oil on his gloves. I left him to his stargazing. At 03:05, engines thudding us through the fog, I visited the engine room. Grease lives there. Our chief engineer, Meg Forbes, swore none of her staff had left their posts between 23 Stone and Eowanas. Boiler rounds are signed in ink on a clipboard that accompanies the watch like a priest's missal. The signatures were present where they belonged. I climbed back to the promenade, the puzzle twisting itself tighter with each gear turn of the paddle wheels. Dawn broke, colourless. The Coast Guard cutter arrived and evacuated Vivian Durant. 2 officers remained to take statements, yet I could see they considered it an accident. They would hand the file to shore detectives and move on, unless I gave them reason not to. Before they left, I asked for 2 hours more to run a demonstration. They agreed, amused. At 9:30, I reconvened my suspects in the Grand Lounge. Passengers gathered behind velvet ropes, hungry for drama larger than a Charleston competition. A steward carried in the broken violin, now strung with coloured ribbon to mark its original shape. I stood them before the fireplace, where an electric flame pretended to crackle. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "this beautiful weekend vowed nostalgia, not tragedy. Miss Durant's fall was no mishap of high heels. Somebody prepared that staircase." Terence Lyle caught his breath. I saw it, though he tried to mask the sound with a cough. I held up a cloth dotted with pale dust. "This is rosin. Combined with oil, it makes a paste used by instrument technicians to quiet squeaky joints. Applied thinly to polished wood, it creates a near-invisible skating rink. Miss Durant's shoes had leather soles. When she gripped the banister, her hand came away slick. She overbalanced on the turn, and fate finished the pushing." A murmur rolled through the spectators. I continued. "Only a few people carried both rosin and oil aboard Magnolia. Vivian herself, of course. The luthier who refurbished her violin isn't on board. That leaves one person within reach of both substances last night." I faced the pianist. "Mr. Lyle, the band greaser tin in your cabin held Hillman's slide oil. I found rosin dust stuck to its rim." Lyle forced a smile too slow for the tempo. "I told you, Captain. I tried to help her. The dust could have rubbed off her dress onto me." "You said you checked for her pulse, yet Miss Durant suffered cervical fractures. Moving her neck could have paralyzed or killed her outright. Any professional musician knows spinal anatomy as well as fingerboard geometry. You never touched her." I set a second object on the mantel, a pristine program of last night's concert. "Your jealousy is printed here. Vivian performed Tartini's Devil's Trill with a piano reduction, but the program credits the arrangement to Harold Bauer. I studied the sheet music in the lounge. It's your unpublished edition. She used your work yet declined to list your name. Slap in the face, wasn't it?" The spectators inhaled collectively. Lyle's left eyelid twitched. "Further," I said, "crew saw you lingering on the boat deck after her performance. You carried a white cloth. We assumed it was to wipe the piano, but the piano is bolted in the lounge." I retrieved that cloth from a plastic bag. Half of it was clean, the other half stiff with dried oil sprinkled with resin. "You used it to smear the banister. When Vivian left the lounge, she would descend alone. Most passengers ride the elevator. You counted on her falling unseen. But a steward surprised her, and she fell early, making your timing an attempted murder rather than a perfect one." "Attempted?" Lyle repeated, the colour draining from his cheeks. "She's alive," I confirmed, "and conscious enough to describe the strange drag on the rail before she slipped." Lyle's shoulders slumped. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "She stole everything. The reviews, the applause, My compositions. You nearly stole her life, I answered. The Coast Guard will hear the rest. The officers stepped forward, cuffs at the ready. Lyle did not resist. The passengers parted to let him pass, beads clacking, shoes whispering against parquet like a crowd of disappointed ghosts. By noon, Magnolia anchored off Tulliver Island for an unscheduled visit with real police. Miss Kendrick urged me to cancel the remainder of the crossing. I refused. We would deliver the guests home, and we would give them music. Saturday night, under calmer skies, Caldwell Priest produced an antique Victrola. Aubrey March, suddenly less sure of himself, agreed to accompany on clarinet. Opal Kendrick sang a smoky Gershwin lullaby. The flappers danced because dancing is what resilience looks like in heels. I stood on the bridge wing, engine vibrations in the marrow of my legs, and listened to an imperfect but honest melody drift upward through the funnel's radiant heat. Colours returned to the sea. The passengers' laughter grew natural again. Vivian Durant would heal. The doctors said she might even play by Christmas. I planned to visit, carrying a braid of rope polished by Magnolia's railings, proof that a fall can become a knot if someone cares to tie the story back together. A ferry captain is not bred for mysteries, yet ships have taught me that any course, however treacherous, can be navigated with eyes open and hand steady on the helm. Last night the straits offered us fog and betrayal. Today they offered wind and a chance to learn from it. I rang the engine telegraph to full steam ahead. The paddles dug in, churning ivory spray against the emerald water, and Magnolia answered her rudder like a dancer who, chastened by night, chooses to greet the dawn.